Right, over to you then, Lena.
Hi, everybody. This is not my real home, just to be clear. I have a nice, fancy Zoom background. Thank you for having me. For those of you who don't know, I'm a licensed psychotherapist, and also I'm something called an Imago certified psychotherapist, which is a specialty in relationship theory. And it's a way that we work not only with couples, but with singles as well, in understanding the dynamics of how our early childhood relationships are impacting our adult relationships. So we're going to get into that a lot more today in this discussion. I'm also an author, and I'm a true crime author, but the book that I wrote is actually more about the idea of psychopathy and narcissism. So we're actually going to touch upon narcissism today, as well as a lot of trauma from people in their relationships come from what we call narcissistic abuse. So we will be touching on that as well today. So that's a little bit about me. And the first question sort of I want to pose to everybody, you don't have to answer it, but why are relationships important? And not only that, why are positive and healthy relationships important? And there's lots of evidence for this. We know that human beings' happiness is directly correlated to the quality of their relationships. And so that's not quantity. It means that the relationships that you do have, even if it's one or two, if you have really healthy, high quality relationships, it's a huge impact, not only on your happiness, but your mental health and your physical health. So on the flip side of that, if you have unhealthy relationships, especially if you have a relationship that's very emotionally damaging or physically damaging, that creates the opposite effect. That can make your life miserable. You can almost feel like you're in a prison. And so relationships have such power to dictate the quality of the happiness of our lives. So I'm personally very passionate about helping people have healthy and positive relationships in their life, because I believe that that's the most important ingredient in our life, but it's also what matters the most. And so another small anecdote is that I started my career in pediatric oncology, and I spent a lot of time working with adult cancer patients as well. And you may have heard some of those cliches that, you know, when people are on their deathbeds, they don't really think about what they accomplished at work or what type of sort of superficial accomplishments they have. Instead, they reflect on the type of relationships they have. And so it's also always important to remember at the end of the day, what really matters is who we love and who loves us. And that's just the most important thing in life. I also had a mentor when I first started my training in Imago. She told me something that stays with me forever. And she said, nobody teaches us how to be in relationships. If you think about it, it's so true. We go to school and we learn about everything else, but we don't learn about how to be in relationships. We don't learn about relationship communication. We don't learn about conflict resolution. We don't learn about what we're going to talk about today, which is how the underlying or unresolved trauma that I believe that we all have to a degree is showing up in our everyday lives and most often in our relationships. So I think it's really important that we learn about how to be in relationships. And so that's hopefully I hope that you all get something out of this talk today that will help you with some of those skills. So first, we're going to ask too, what is trauma? I mean, there's so many ways to define it. What I think a lot of people don't realize is that trauma is subjective, which means that it's different for all of us, and everybody has a different response to something. And so what might be traumatic for one person is not traumatic for another person. But the technical definition of it is it's a response to a deeply disturbing event that interferes with one's ability to cope. And I like to think of it as a traumatic experience or repeated experiences alter the way we see the world. And so, you know, when we're born and we're children, most of us don't come into the world as distrustful, or, you know, where most children are happy. And I always like to say, when my children were really young, especially before they understood what the concept of shame was, they would freely run around in their diapers, and, you know, they had no fear of judgment. And so that's, as we grow older, we get a lot of messages that make us feel shame about ourselves, that make us change how we see the world. And so I think trauma is also when we lose trust, when we lose a sense of safety. And it doesn't have to be physical safety. It can often be emotional safety. And that just changes how, and whatever has happened to us in our lives can alter that. And I think many, many of us have had experiences that have changed how we view our safety in the world and our trust in people and in the world. So symptoms of trauma, and a lot of the time, we don't even know that we've experienced it because trauma is stored in our body. And I like to give the example, I'm very candid about, I've worked through my own trauma, and my personal trauma was a medical trauma. And I, 1 year later after the incident, I woke up one day, I didn't even realize it had been 1 year. And I felt this deep, deep depression come over me. And I felt like I couldn't function. And I just cried. And I didn't understand what was wrong with me. It was like somebody had just put a dark cloud over me. And I went through the next few days feeling like that. And I didn't understand why, because that's just really not how I normally am. And then I put 2 and 2 together and I realized that it had been 1 year since my past trauma. And so sometimes it comes up on us and we don't even know. And so people will talk about the anniversary of a traumatic experience, which could be the anniversary of a death of a loved one, or the anniversary of a life-threatening illness diagnosis, or trauma can even be witnessing something happening. So that's called vicarious trauma. So if you even watch somebody get hit by a car, and that can bring you real trauma symptoms. So it doesn't even have to happen to you. Watching a loved one, go through cancer treatments, for example, there's all these type of things that can happen. You could have been bullied as a child, that can create a trauma response. So it's not just as serious as coming back from war or, rape or sexual assault or something like that. It can come in many, many forms. And some of the symptoms of trauma that you might feel, and there's going to be more than I'm going to name, but just to give you an overview, the feeling of loss of control, so that can manifest as anxiety when we feel out of control. Hypervigilance, so that sort of feeling, nervous. A lot of the time that can be paranoia. We can constantly be paranoid about what other people are thinking about us, and we're hypervigilant about trying to control what other people think about us. General feeling of unsafety, that could also be not just feeling physically unsafe, but just feeling unsafe, which is, it can be an emotional experience as well. Again, the feeling like you can't trust people, irritability, agitation, feeling overwhelmed, guilt, shame, loneliness, loss of interest in activities. More serious symptoms, flashbacks, nightmares, disassociation from yourself, actively avoiding people and situations, feelings of fear and dread. So that's, just some, there's more than that as well. And trauma is also interesting because it really pushes our nervous systems to the point where we can't self-regulate anymore. And that's when we really feel out of control. That can look like feelings of panic and anxiety. So you can think of a time, when your nervous system is activated. You think about a time when you're late somewhere and you're rushing to get there, and you're sort of feeling that adrenaline and that nervousness that you're not going to get there on time. That is similar to what you might feel in a situation of trauma coming back to you, is that state of your nervous system. People with serious trauma, they're kind of perpetually in that state, which is awful, as you can imagine. And, the other side of it is the nervous system can go kick into underdrive, and that could mean that you are numb to everything. So it's the opposite. You can be completely numb, fatigue, brain fog, disconnection from the world, depression. So you can either be, hyperactive, or you can be completely numb. So everybody sort of has a different manifestation of this. And then just quickly, just to people differentiate, I look at trauma as different from PTSD and something called CPTSD, which is complex post-traumatic stress disorder. You may have heard of post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a clinical disorder and involves uncontrollable thoughts, fear, anxiety, disassociation, nightmares, flashbacks, insomnia, reliving the event over and over again. And complex PTSD is for people who have been repeatedly exposed to traumatic situations, and that's ongoing. So you can think of ongoing childhood neglect, ongoing abuse of any kind, living in a war zone, human trafficking. So a lot of people who have experienced those horrible things have a diagnosis of complex PTSD. But you do not have to have those diagnoses to have experienced trauma. And so that's, again, trauma is subjective. So I want everybody to come away from this and understanding that, and that, you know, sometimes we try to deny that other people have been through much worse. And so that means our trauma is not important. I know I do that a lot, where I try to deny my experience and my feelings because I don't think it's important, and that other people have had much worse things to deal with. And so I actually want to ask people too, to not judge your trauma, and that your trauma matters and it's important, and don't disintegrate it, don't diminish it. It's important to acknowledge it no matter what it is. Even if you think it's silly, it's your trauma and it's important. So what we're really here today is to talk about relational trauma and developmental trauma and how that's showing up in our adult relationships. And relational trauma, a lot of the time, has to do with our childhoods and repeated behaviors that we've learned through a parent or a caregiver. And what happens is there's different ways. Sometimes the harm is caused intentionally and sometimes it's unintentional. A lot of the times, if you go back to the quote about nobody teaches us how to be in relationships, a lot of the times our parents were doing the best they could, our caregivers were doing the best they could, and they didn't necessarily have the best role models. And so a lot of the times they may be very much unintentionally causing some type of trauma with their children and not meaning it. That being said, I always like to say that if you were traumatized or you had relational damage from a parent or caregiver, or even a teacher or somebody, an adult in your life, that it's never okay. And although we can understand it, we don't ever have to excuse it. So I want people to know that as well. And if somebody has caused harm to us, and we'll go over this a little bit later, it's so important for survivors of trauma and for healing to be able to name the harm. Again, we do a disservice to ourselves when we diminish any harm that has been caused to us. And so it's really important that we are able to name that harm. And so examples of relational trauma, they can be as extreme, you know, as neglect and abandonment. It could be feeling invisible. It can be constant criticism, which is one that I see a lot in my practice. I also see a lot of clients whose parents or, you know, primary caregivers made them feel like their voice was not important. So the parent or the caregiver always dictated what they had to do, or shot down their dreams, or told them that their dreams were silly. That can cause relational trauma. I have a lot of clients who have been parentified, which means that the parent or the caregiver puts the child in the position of the parent when they're very young, and the child feels like they have to meet the emotional needs of the parent or the caregiver, or they have to take care of the parent. That causes a lot of relational trauma that shows up in adulthood. And so that's a lot about relying on the child to meet the parent's emotional needs. One that people often don't think about is what we call enmeshment, which means that the parent or the caregiver is overly involved in the child's life. And again, that sort of looks like what I said before, which is maybe, you know, I'll give an example of somebody who wanted to ride horses, and the mother forced her to do ballet instead, you know, and always made those type of decisions. And the child as she grew older, never learned to trust herself or feel like she knew herself, because everything was always dictated by her mother, who told her what was best for her and never let her pursue her own interests or her own dreams. And similarly to relational trauma, you can say developmental trauma. A lot of the times that's from what they say invisible childhood experiences, which could be, more verbal abuse, neglect, manipulation. And what's also interesting is I also don't want to forget that relational trauma can happen in adulthood as well, and from partners in adulthood. And so many of us may have had a relationship with a romantic partner that was very traumatic. Maybe there was infidelity that causes relational trauma as well. We have, what I call narcissistic abuse, or what is known as narcissistic abuse. I feel a lot of trauma from adult relationships stems from some form of narcissistic abuse. And these people follow a pattern. So when you first meet somebody who has these abusive tendencies, they do something called love bombing, which means they're like Prince or Princess Charming. And they come on very strong right away. They know they want to be with you. And they might say things like, oh, you're the one. The relationship moves very, very fast. In the beginning, you may even be a little bit taken aback, because it's very strange to have somebody be so sure about you from the beginning. And then as time goes on and they sort of win you over, because everybody likes to feel adored and cherished and feel like a priority. And some of us who have never had that in our lives, it's really alluring when somebody comes into our life and acts like we are the king or the queen, and that we are just showered with love and affection. And candidly speaking, some of my interest in this is that I was in a relationship like this, and it was very, very damaging. I'm also very passionate about awareness on this topic. So after the love bombing, when the person feels like they've sort of won you over, they may shift to the devalue phase. And the devalue phase very much feels like you're with a Jekyll and Hyde. So it's like you're walking on eggshells. Walking on eggshells when you don't know how to anticipate another person's mood and what you're going to get with them can cause relational trauma as well. And so,
yeah, just as an example, say 7 days. Yeah.
some of these things that these people do is gaslighting. So
Lena,
some of you may
really
know
sorry.
gaslighting.
Just a moment, Lena, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Can I just ask everyone to mute, please? Because I have muted everyone, but someone is unmuting themselves. So I've tried to manually mute. Hopefully that should work. Sorry, Lena.
Yeah, that should help. Okay. So many of you may have heard of gaslighting. That means when we approach somebody with a hurt or a concern. I felt hurt when you screamed at me the other day. What they'll do is they'll turn around and make you question your sanity, and they'll say, oh, you're so sensitive, or I was just joking, you can't take a joke. So it's a way for them to avoid accountability, but that also creates a lot of emotional distress, and that constantly happens. There's also something called blame shifting, which happens when you approach somebody. I was really upset when you yelled at me the other day. Blame shifting would look like, well, I wouldn't have yelled at you if you hadn't done this. So again, there's no accountability for those actions. Other things involved in narcissistic abuse in the devalue phase are criticism, pathological lying, infidelity again, stonewalling, which is when somebody shuts down. So when you're trying to engage them or talk to them and they won't talk to you, sometimes stonewalling can go on for days. A lot of people have experienced this as a child from caregivers, and it's really, really damaging. I've had clients tell me, my mother would get mad at me and wouldn't speak to me for 3 days, and for a 5-year-old child, and then they're constantly asking, mommy, what's wrong? Mommy, what's wrong? It's very, very damaging. Projecting, a lot of the times abusive people, they project onto you what they're actually doing themselves. And then of course, physical and sexual abuse can happen. Ongoing emotional unavailability is sort of like the stonewalling. So if any of that has happened to you as an adult in a relationship, that also causes a lot of trauma. It really inhibits our ability to have healthy relationships, makes us lose our sense of trust, and makes us feel some of those trauma symptoms of feeling hypervigilant and paranoid. So we're going to look at how relational trauma, what we just talked about, will show up in adulthood now in our relationships. And so I'm going to put at the end some book recommendations for people if you want to follow up on some of this. One of the books I'm going to put later on is called Attached. A lot of people may have read it already. It's quite well known, but has relational trauma from childhood and adulthood looks like attachment issues. So we have, avoidant attached people, and that's feeling like you can't rely on anybody, being really independent and having that self-sufficiency, but also feeling a lot of loneliness and shame. We have people who are anxiously attached, where they feel overly clingy to somebody. They sacrifice their own needs constantly to be in a relationship with someone else. So they sort of lose themselves in the relationship, and they'll do anything to keep their partner. So a lot of the times they're often suppressing their own needs to be with somebody else. They'll overlook, red flags, normalize abusive behaviors, because again, if that was what we knew, then it's normal for us. And it's hard to label it as wrong when it feels normal. Low self-esteem. And then even some people who have had hard childhoods, they will sort of turn narcissistic, and they'll have feelings of superiority and needing to feel powerful and control in relationships, and have inability to connect in relationships and trust issues as well. Another big one is fear of abandonment. So people with trauma in their adult relationships often fear abandonment, often fear being left. There's also a concept called trauma bonding, which I think is important to mention, which is when we form a bond to the person who is mistreating us or abusing us. And then we sort of develop a sympathy for them. Oftentimes, that's what happens when we make excuses or we rationalize or normalize behavior that's very harmful to us. And it's sort of a roller coaster when we're in these relationships with a lot of highs and lows, where, again, it's the Jekyll and Hyde. It's a cycle that creates an intense need to be validated, because we'll crash when the person is being harsh and critical or abusive towards us. And then as the cycle continues, the way that these people keep you is, well, then either they apologize or they act like nothing's happened, or they turn back to being very charming again. And that creates a cycle that creates a trauma bond. And that's why sometimes it's very hard to leave these type of relationships, because we don't realize that we're in a trauma bond, and that it's almost like a drug. And so it's a great emotional reward when a person who has mistreated us all of a sudden showers us with love and attention. And it's a form of manipulation, and it's something that is very dangerous, because over time trauma bonds can strengthen, and that's what makes it harder to leave. So oftentimes the longer somebody is in a relationship, the more the trauma bond strengthens. And I recently watched a series on Netflix about the Nexi. It's called The Vow. There's also another one called Seduced, which I have not seen yet, but it's about a cult leader named Keith Raniere, who founded a cult that's called Nexium. And within that cult, he had famous people, he had Hollywood actresses and actors in it. And it was also an underground sort of sex cult where they had slaves and branded people. And that's a very good example of a trauma bond. We'll see, well, why did those, women stay in those situations? Why didn't they leave? That's a big example of trauma bonding and how psychologically damaging it is when that happens, and how hard it makes it to leave bad situations. I'm going to discuss the imago theory now, which is what I do, and hopefully this will bring some insight into what's going on with our own selves. So the imago theory was developed by a man named Harville Hendrix, and I'm going to put his books in the chat after we sign off as well, so you can see his books. And he has a theory, and I always tell people that when I give you a theory, you don't have to believe it, so just take what makes sense to you, and you can throw out whatever doesn't make sense to you. But I have found working in this field, in the world of couples and relationship therapy for 10 years, that it seems to be true for most people. And the theory is that, again, no matter how ideal our childhoods were, or even if we had really good role models in our lives, none of us escapes childhood unscathed. And that means as we become adults, every single one of us has unmet needs from childhood. And so, again, maybe, an example is if our father was always absent, for example, an unmet need might be that we need somebody to be very present in our lives, very physically present. We may need a lot of quality time with them because our unmet need was that we didn't get that time, or that person wasn't present for us. And so Harville Hendrix theorizes that all these unmet needs from childhood that we've built up along the way, and we also develop defenses and adaptations to hide them because we don't want to address it because it's painful. Says we're seeking to heal those childhood wounds and unmet needs through our current romantic partners. And so there's a subconscious need to heal our old trauma and our unmet needs through the current partners. And sometimes that gets us into trouble. So the people we're attracted to, a lot of the times they can have both the best and the worst characteristics of a primary caregiver. And a lot of the time too, the things that are attractive to us about someone in the beginning often later end up being the things that annoy us or repel us. So it's very interesting what happens with how we're subconsciously often choosing people. And through Imago, we also have something called a hailstorm turtle dynamic. And we say, usually in couples, we usually see somebody who's a hailstorm and somebody who's a turtle. And that's how we respond to emotional threat. So it's sort of like a fight or flight response. And so when a hailstorm feels a threat, and again, it's a threat of maybe my partner's going to leave me, they hail, and that means they get really loud, they get really big, the energy is very strong, and they want to engage all the time. And they're usually with a partner who's a turtle, and the turtle's the opposite. So when the turtle feels threatened or feels unsafe or feels criticized, the turtle, as you can imagine, goes into the shell, and that's shutting down. I also say the turtle can be a snapping turtle. The turtle is not necessarily shy or demure. They can come out and snap and say some really cruel things. And so you have a turtle shutting down, you have a hailstorm begging to get connection, and they kind of get driven further and further apart. So in Imago, one of the things that we do is work to get the turtle to come out of their shell a little bit more, and the hailstorm to sort of hail less. And so we do that by creating safety. But before we can do that, we need to understand what's going on. What are we seeking to heal through our partners now? What unmet needs do we have that we're looking for our partner to heal in us? And so what I want everybody to think about, and you don't have to answer, you don't have to have the answer today even, but I want you to think about some of the childhood messages you received. Again, it doesn't have to be from a parent. It could have been from a teacher. It could have been from peers. But these messages can be conscious or unconscious. So a conscious message would be do well in school, play a sport, always be responsible. An unconscious message is kind of like what I mentioned earlier about the mother whose daughter wanted to ride horses, but she made her do ballet instead. The message is that you don't know what's best for yourself. So that would be a message of a subconscious message. So what's really important is understanding those messages for us. It's also because we internally repeat them and we don't really realize it. So if our main message was, I can't trust myself, I don't know what's best for myself, subconsciously or consciously, that's going to be dictating how we feel about ourselves later on in life. And until we're able to name those messages and divorce ourselves from those messages, I work with a lot of clients and I tell them that the messages that you received about yourself that are negative and holding you back from living the life that you want to live are not your messages. They're not the messages you gave yourself. They're the messages from somebody else who has their own issues to work out. So when we can identify the messages that are holding us back or creating that trauma in our lives, we can start to learn ways to take those messages off of us and create our own messages for ourselves that we deserve to have. And then the other thing I want everybody to think about is what might some of your unmet needs from childhood be? So what didn't I get when I was a kid that I still need now? So thinking about that, what didn't I get as a kid? What needs do I have that were not met as a child? And what do I need now? Is that still true today? Am I still seeking those same things? Whether it's attention, affection, validation is a really big one, anything you can think of. So that's going to be really, really important in your own healing journeys, is figuring those things out and then moving away from them and learning sometimes how we can get some of those needs met more, either from ourselves or sometimes even from our partners. And that's a lot of the work we do in Imago, is by uncovering those unmet needs with partners. We can say, hey, you know, your partner, for example, felt really criticized as a child, and now what she really needs from you is to feel validation and love. Maybe an assignment I'll give is, I need you to text your wife or your girlfriend or your partner some affirmations every day. And so by the partner texting, I love you, you're beautiful, and appreciation, thank you for walking the dog tonight, that helps to erase some of the hurt of the childhood when you were overly criticized by parents. So it is possible to work with people and help get some of those unmet needs met through their current partner once they realize what's going on with the struggle there. For people who are single, I think you're in a great position to understand, again, what your unmet needs are and what you might be seeking. So when you do enter a relationship, you know exactly, you know, what's going on with you, and you can communicate that to a new partner and work with them, really knowing yourself, which is really, I think, a positive thing. So ingredients of a healthy relationship. I always like to tell people, well, how do you want to feel, or how do you know you're in a good relationship? Again, the number one word I use is safety. You know, to feel safe, to not feel like you're, the walking on eggshells thing, or in that hyper vigilant mode, or that you can really trust this person, is a really amazing thing, to feel safety. To feel like your thoughts and feelings are heard and taken seriously, sort of the opposite of what we talked about before, the gaslighting and the blame shifting. We want a partner who's willing to work on themselves, and just as we should be willing to work on ourselves, it's a very reciprocal thing. And so that means, being able to have accountability, admit when we're wrong, apologize, and to actually want to grow. And then, something I saw recently was an article about the people in the happiest relationships have something called psychological flexibility, which means, they adapt to situations, they're easygoing, they can live in the present moment. This is really hard for people who have trauma as well. So it's easier said than done. So that's a part of psychological flexibility, I think, is also having to work through some trauma. So I guess that leaves us with, okay, all of this is great, but how do I begin the healing process, or what do I do about this now that, I'm thinking about my unmet needs, I'm thinking about my childhood messages? Well, first, like I said earlier, acknowledging what happened to us, and acknowledging that as our truth and that it matters, and that our needs matter. Our needs mattered then as children, our needs matter now as an adult. And if we were mistreated or something happened to us as children, it was not our fault. And that's really important to know. So we have to sort of claim what happened to us, acknowledge it, and say that, what happened to me was hurtful, it was horrible, it was, whatever language you have for it. And that I matter and my needs matter. And that can take a lot of work as well, because some of us have had so many messages, either subconsciously or consciously, that make us feel like we don't matter or our needs don't matter. And so it's a lot of work of retraining our brains and rewiring and giving ourselves new messages. One of the things we do with people who have experienced trauma is envisioning our inner child and comforting our inner child. Now, I like to say, like, look at yourself, go back in time and look at yourself as that innocent little child, whatever age you want, 3, 5 years old. That little child did not deserve to have that hurt. And so, sometimes we ask, close your eyes and go back and comfort your inner child. That child did not deserve that hurt. That child needed comfort, and we need comfort as adults still. Again, allowing ourselves to feel our feelings without judgment, which we've sort of had the theme of today. And if you can, to work with a professional, obviously, around this stuff is ideal. And if you can't, or if, sometimes it's financially difficult, there are a lot of good books too. And again, I'm going to put some of those in the chat that can help. And another thing that we need to do is to start to learn how to establish boundaries. And that's being able to, say no to people, to look out for our needs, and to do it without worrying that we're going to hurt somebody else, saying no, telling people when they have hurt us. It's something that is really important. And again, that's really easier said than done. That's something ideally, hopefully, if you have trouble establishing boundaries with people because of trauma, hopefully a professional can work with you, because a lot of this stuff can be really long-term work. And then, because I said earlier that trauma is stored in our bodies, and it can create a response that we're not even aware that that anxiety we feel or that panic we feel could be coming from some kind of trauma. And so activities that calm the body are very, very helpful, especially if you can do it on a regular basis. And so, we say in the trauma world, you calm the body first and then you calm the mind. So everybody probably knows already, there's deep breathing, exercises that focus on the here and now. So bringing ourselves into the present. A lot of times with trauma is happening, it's a feeling that in the present, I'm not safe. And so if we're feeling unsafe in a present moment and we are safe, like we're in our homes, we're, by ourselves, grounding to the here and now and being able to say, I am safe now. What happened to me is in the past. I am safe right now. And, that is very helpful as well, being in the present. And, there's many other things, yoga, meditation, exercise. There's lots of apps now, I think, that can help you with all of this stuff. So if you ever feel like you're in that spot of anxiety or hypervigilance or paranoia, these calming exercises of the body, remember, calm the body, then calm the mind. And a lot of the times it's more effective if it's something that you can do on a regular basis, even if it's, 5 or 10 minutes a day, even that regular basis actually does accumulate to becoming very helpful later on. And then finally, before we do a Q&A, if anybody has any questions to ask, there's different types of trauma therapy for anybody who is curious and wants to explore that further. There's obviously always talk therapy, but there is EMDR, which is something I've done and I found highly effective. It's called eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And so it's basically you kind of hold this buzzer in your hand and the therapist walks you through and helps you replace the traumatic memories in your brain with new messages. And I found that personally to be highly effective. There's also something called brain spotting, which I've also done. I didn't like it as much as EMDR, but people like different things. And so some people have found brain spotting to be highly effective. And that is something that helps access hidden traumatic memories. And it locates points in your visual field. So it's more to do with accessing the traumatic memories in the brain. And then there's something called neurofeedback, which supplies information to the brain that helps regulate the body's autonomic nervous stress response. So I've heard that's really helpful too. I have not done that for myself, but I've heard it's really good. And then mostly, patience. when we're working through stuff, again, it's a process. It is not a linear process. There are a lot of ups and downs, and it's, you know, cliffs and peaks and valleys, and it's a long process, and it requires a lot of kindness and patience with ourselves, and to realize, you know, when you address this stuff, it's really difficult. That's why so many people avoid addressing complicated and hard things, because it's so much easier to avoid it. And so when we start to uncover this stuff, it can be really, really painful at first, and we can feel like we have a lot of setbacks, and that's really normal, and it's just part of the process. And just, again, be kind and patient to yourselves. So that's what I have today. I will also, like I said, later put a bunch of the book resources I have in the chat box. And before that, I think we wanted to see if anybody had any questions, and they can be typed into the chat box, and then somebody from the library will read them to me. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to type them in. Okay, see a bunch of questions in the box. I'll make sure I get to all of them. The third technique was neurofeedback. So we have EMDR. I'll type this in the chat box too. EMDR, brain spotting, and neurofeedback are some of the techniques that involve the brain dealing with trauma. Okay, I see. Okay, let me see. Tactics. Okay, this is a good question. Can you recommend tactics for dealing with things like blame shifting? Yes, there's something, I'm going to put this in the chat box too. It's called gray rocking and yellow rock. You can Google those, but I'll explain them. One of the things, you know, when you deal with people who are using these sort of toxic techniques to shut conversations down or to manipulate you, you know, one of the things you can do is just not engage, which is, you know, just to, a lot of the time is just put up like a gray rock, which is like actually being very boring and very just, you know, whatever, is to not react. That's kind of a boundary as well. Again, one of the things I always ask is, how often is the person doing this blame shifting? How much a part of your life are they? And if it's really bad, is this something that you can continue to put up with? Now, people in our lives, often family members or coworkers, we can't just cut them out. So, you know, sometimes we do have to ask ourselves, can I cut this person out? If it feels like we can't do that, then again, a lot of the times the best thing to do with these people is not engaging and not giving any reactions to the person. And then also Google gray rock. There's a lot of really good articles, and this is how you actually can deal with a lot of people who are doing all these type of things like gaslighting, blame shifting. Okay, somebody asked, how long was my abusive relationship and how long did it take to recover from it? This is actually crazy because my abusive relationship was very short. It was only about 3 months. And I thank God every day that's all it was, because I work with people and I know people who have been caught in these cycles for years, but it very much followed, it moved very fast. The love bombing was very intense from the beginning. The devalue phase was incredibly just psychologically damaging, even in a short amount of time. This particular person made hints at physical abuse. So while it never became physically abusive, he would do things like, you know, put a pillow over my face and then act like he was joking. And so what ended up happening was this person had to move across the country. And so it was actually a good excuse for me then to realize I was in a trauma bond at that point, even as quickly as, a few months that can happen. And I felt so lucky that I was able to have that clarity to recognize it. And that's when I started to become very passionate about helping people understand these dynamics to get out of them, because I think there's going to be a question about this, but are these people able to be rehabilitated, the ones who are extremely abusive and don't have any self-awareness or insight and are unwilling to change? So I will.
Lena, somebody's asked how long, what are your recommendations for breaking a trauma bond?
Oh, yes, sorry, did I miss that one? Okay. Yeah, the recommendations are definitely, if you can see a therapist who is skilled in this type of thing, who understands trauma bonds, that's really helpful. Again, once you understand, I think it's really powerful to know that you're in one at first, because I think that's when the light bulb starts to go off, is how can we start to extricate ourselves from that trauma bond once we realize that we are in it. Because a lot of the times nobody knows that they're in one until somebody names it for them. So naming it and understanding that that's what's going on is a huge, huge step. And again, as I said, these things can be so difficult to break away from. They're so complicated. They're so psychologically damaging that, ideally, it would be great if you could work with, again, a therapist or somebody who's experienced. But I will put in some books too at the end that should address some of this. And one woman, I'll put her name here now. Shahida Arabi is her name, and Dr. Ramani Durvasula for trauma bonds and abusive relationships and narcissistic abuse. So those, in addition, I think are really helpful.
Somebody else has a question. You said both parties need to work together. What if the other person doesn't want to? And is this a red flag to give up?
Yeah, so if the other person doesn't want to, then it's probably, I would say, definitely a red flag to give up. And I would also ask, again, in the most sensitive way possible, because it could be a trauma bond situation. The question becomes, why are you fighting for somebody who says they don't want to be with you? So that's a question to ask yourself, as you might be fighting for the wrong person or the wrong thing. And what you want and deserve is to be with somebody who loves you and wants to be with you and wants to work it out. I also realized I sent to Amy instead of everyone for the books on trauma bonding. I think there's more questions. Okay. Oh, lots of great questions. Sorry, I'm going through all of them. I missed a lot. Which technique does work best for couples? Aisha, are you talking about for trauma, like EMDR, neurofeedback? If you could type in the chat box.
Yes.
Oh, yes. Okay. That's a really good question. I've actually not seen the trauma therapies done with couples. That's a good question. I'm going to research that and get back to you, because I know how to find you. So is that okay?
Thank you. Yes.
Okay. Okay. That's a really good question. Okay. Yes. Oh, I went back.
Somebody's also asked, can narcissists, sorry, I've missed that. Can narcissists change their behavior? I think.
So narcissism is on it was on a spectrum. So if you could think of the spectrum of 1 to 10, and at 1, like the least narcissistic, which is actually not very healthy either. That's where, there's a lot of people pleasing, or they call them egoists, people who never developed a sense of self, usually because of trauma, and don't have any self-esteem. And then in the middle of the spectrum, it's what they call healthy narcissism, which is good. It's where you want to be. It's, you know, you have confidence in yourself, but you have empathy for other people. And then at the high end of the spectrum, you have severe malignant narcissism, which is characterized by lack of empathy, entitlement, exploitation. And, you know, it manifests with a lot of the things we talked about today, with gaslighting, blame shifting, walking on eggshells, criticizing, stonewalling, all of these things. It's repeated patterns of behavior. So with narcissists, I think there was a question on friendships with narcissists too. It really depends on where one falls on the spectrum. And the higher the person is on the spectrum is when it's incredibly dangerous. And it's, at that point, I would say it's dangerous and it's beyond repair. And that person would need many, many years of therapy and would want to change, which is, I've almost never seen that on the high end of the spectrum. But there are people who are narcissistic that do have some self-awareness and do have some insight and can see some things and are willing to change. In those situations, you know, it's a personal decision, but there are some people who are higher on the narcissistic spectrum that do want to change and that will work in couples therapy with insight and awareness. But on the very high end, and the patterns are constant and you feel unsafe, even just emotionally unsafe, you feel like a shell of yourself, you feel miserable, then oftentimes those people will just continue to gaslight you, blame shift on you, make it seem like it's all your fault. And at that point, it's for your safety and your mental health is best to try to break away.
There's another question. Why is it always women who seem to seek help and not the men who often cause it?
That's a great question. You know, I think that oftentimes, you know, I think we have a crisis sometimes with what's happening with men and boys. And I've written a lot about this, that culturally, in all cultures I've seen, boys are given the messages that they can't ask for help. And there's a lot of shame and stigma around asking for help and being vulnerable. And they never really learn how. They're taught from a very young age to shut off their emotions. And women were more encouraged to do that. And so I think that most of the time, you know, we have more women than men that are seeking help and looking inward, and definitely abuse is much more of a problem, especially physical abuse, dangerous abuse. You know, men kill their partners way more than women do. It's just the statistics, you can't even compare them. So I think it's an international crisis, you know, that we're having. And the hopeful thing is that I do think with parenting trends now, they are shifting to helping boys be more social emotional and to learn to talk about their feelings, and that they are allowed to experience feelings other than anger and sexual desire, which, you know, that's only the acceptable emotions boys are taught that they're allowed to have. So I am seeing a shift with that. And so I do hope that with time, we'll encourage boys and men to be able to be more introspective and less violent and less abusive, and that they'll learn from a young age.
Somebody's also asked, if you recognize you're a Hale, how can you be less Hale?
So what
Or
you
how
want
can you
to
learn to be less Hale? Sorry.
That's a great question. Yes. So first you want to remember that when you're in your hailstorm mode, that's you're activated. In Imago, we say your reptilian brain is activated, which means it's kind of beyond your control at that point. It's your survival fight or flight response that's kicked in. So one of the things you want to do is to notice that you're in reptilian brain, or that you're hailing, and that what it's coming from is it's coming from a place of fear and trying to get that need met. So if you're hailing and you're scared of abandonment, for example, you're trying to reconnect because you're scared of abandonment. And so oftentimes what you want to do is try to calm yourself first before trying to re-engage with somebody else until you're out of that reptilian brain. And again, that's a really tough thing to do. It's much easier said than done. And if you're in a couple, I think it also requires a lot of work with the turtle, again, being able to re-engage more, because it's actually a mutual thing. It's a dynamic. It's not really one person's fault or the other. So with the couples work, it's about both partners understanding the dynamic and both partners, you know, one hailing a little less and the turtle coming out more, and both stretching and working to meet each other's needs. But definitely being able to understand when we're in reactivity, and that for us, it's a survival mechanism, and that we're reacting out of something and some unmet need. If we can calm down first and then think logically about how we want to address the situation, that's definitely one of the tactics we use in Imago.
There is another question. How can the police understand abuse, domestic violence against women is a serious matter?
I think we need a whole reform of, you know, I'm in the US, definitely if you've been watching a lot of the news, we need a whole police reform here. I'm sure it's, you know, it's kind of a patriarchal institution in itself. And I think we need a lot more mental health professionals working with the police, working in trainings. You know, here we're sort of starting to talk about what would it look like to have mental health professionals respond to, you know, different calls as opposed to police. But I definitely think we need a merge between, you know, law enforcement and mental health and training, and we need mental health way more involved in police, because you're right, they don't, a lot of the times they do not understand domestic violence, they do not understand abuse, and they don't know how to respond to it, and it is a big problem. I see one about, can you suggest any ways of being friends with a narcissist and how to set effective boundaries? Again, it depends how narcissistic the person is, how important they are to you. You know, with narcissists, you need really strong boundaries if you are going to be in relationships with them, which is just telling them, you can't talk to me like that. And, you know, I'm not going to talk to you until you learn how to talk better to me. You know, things like that. You need really, really strong boundaries to be friends with a narcissist, which basically requires you having to put up these boundaries that say you can't take advantage of me or walk all over me. Because the thing about people with narcissistic tendencies is they'll take advantage of you any chance that they get. And so you need to be super strong. And I think all of us at some point have had to deal with people with narcissistic tendencies. Doesn't mean they're a full-blown narcissist, but a lot of the time that requires all of us putting up boundaries with them and just not letting them get away with too much. We all know those people that they'll get away with whatever they can. So that would be my main suggestion. Constant boundaries, constant, and then giving them consequences to those boundaries. So if you say, I'm not going to talk to you anymore if you talk to me like that, you actually have to follow through with that as well. Yes, I see Eliza. Yeah.
Could you expand on the differences between a normal bond and a trauma bond? Can a trauma bond be healed?
A normal bond and a trauma bond. Yeah. So the normal bond is not based on highs and lows and like needing that validation from your partner and being in a situation where someone's mistreating you and you are on their side sometimes or sympathizing with them. A normal bond is when you're treated well and you're treating the other person well and you respect each other's boundaries and you treat each other well and you feel that sense of calm and safety, and there's, you know, trust. There's a lot of trust, there's a lot of safety. With a trauma bond, you don't feel the trust and the safety. It's not there. In fact, you're probably going to feel really anxious again, hypervigilant, upset. There's going to be a lot of highs and lows. You might, you know, again, rationalize or make excuses for being treated really badly. And safe, healthy bonds, you're not making excuses. You know, your thoughts and feelings are respected and you feel safe and you feel like you're in a trusting relationship. Yeah, there's female narcissists too. I see Constantine said, yeah, for sure, there are. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of studies on that as much as I would have liked to see. Let me see, I want to make sure I'm not missing any questions. Okay, yes, Eliza, yes, Shahida Arabi books are very good. She has one called Power, which I think is really good. Dr. Ramani is really great too with books on this stuff. How does one be less turtle or less hail? Yeah, so we already kind of went over that, just understanding when we're having a reaction, like when we feel we want to pull away or when we feel we want to get big energy, that we're recognizing that it's a response to a perceived threat and that it's a reaction out of fear and an unmet need. And if we can take time to calm down, take a break, come back to our normal state of mind, then we can talk about, and then we can start thinking about how we want to approach talking to somebody.
Somebody's asked as well, are there more mental health professionals helping at schools?
No, where I am, definitely not. Again, I think it's a big problem, you know, probably everywhere. At my children's school, which is, you know, one of the best public elementary schools or, you know, primary schools in our city, you know, we don't often always have, you know, full-time nurse or full-time counseling all the time. So we do now, but there's other schools that don't. So I would also like to see, again, in my perfect world, relationship classes, you know, actual classes starting at a very young age where children are learning how to deal with emotions, feelings, how to, you know, to deal with relationships and conflict resolution skills and communication. What if your parents are narcissistic? Yeah, there's really good books on that too. A lot of what we talked about today is, again, a result of being parented by a narcissist. And that's a lot of work to go through. And so hopefully, you know, getting help. I think the one book I'm thinking of now about the narcissistic parents, it's about narcissistic mothers. That's a good book. I'm getting it for you now. It's called Will I Ever Be Good Enough? And then how to handle a narcissist, and then narcissistic mothers, how to handle a narcissistic parent and recover. Put that in the chat too. A lot of the things we talked about today with the relational trauma and developmental trauma is usually, a lot of the time it is from a narcissistic parent. Imago books, yes, and training and resources, sure. Mala, if you could, can you put your email in the box for me? But I'm gonna put the Imago books in the chat, but then I can, well, actually I can just put you now. Imago Relationships International should help you find trainings. Imago therapists are all over the world. Getting the love you want and keeping the love you find. And Making Marriage Simple are all by Harville Hendricks, are the Imago books.
The question, there's another question in the box. How to recognize somebody that will be abusive? What is the biggest red flag?
Biggest red flag is the love bombing. So in the beginning, I mean, not everybody who comes on really strong is going to be a narcissist. But if you think about it, if somebody doesn't know you very well and they're sure that they want to be with you, that's a red flag. If they're really going over the top to win you over, usually there's an agenda behind it. And people with psychopathic traits and narcissistic traits, this is something they all do. They all are very manipulative in the beginning, know how to win you over, come on really strong. The second red flag is if you are with somebody who is perfect and loving and amazing, and they start to turn on you, and in the sense that they start shifting to these tactics that we discussed, such as gaslighting and blame shifting and criticism and this Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde type dynamic, that's a huge, huge red flag. That's as soon as somebody goes from love bombing you to the devalue phase, then you know that it's almost always going to get worse and it's never going to get better. And thank you everyone for your kind comments. I see them.
Yeah, there's lots of lovely comments, and somebody's asked, will you be doing the talk again or another talk again?
I hope to, yeah. My cousin, Nadia Aberdeen, I'll put her, she has some of my recorded talks on her YouTube channel. So she's actually who Denka at the libraries here saw me on one of Nadia's talks, and that's how this happened today. So. Okay. Yeah, thank you, everybody. Okay, I think maybe that's, okay, I see some other stuff coming in. I recognize I'm guilty of stonewalling. Hi, Chrissy, lots of love to you. I recognize I'm guilty of stonewalling. How can I get better at not doing this? Well, first of all, I just want to say it's amazing that you want to get better at this and that you've recognized. I think it's so awesome when people are aware of what they're doing and that they want to change. And so, you know, Loki, I think that stonewalling again is a reaction to trauma, is that sometimes we learn somewhere along the way in our lives that shutting down is easier to do. And so again, it's a long journey, but the first step is recognizing what you're doing and that it's in response to fear. It's not what you want. You don't want to shut down, but it's easy to do. And it's a response that's worked for you your whole life, you know? And so, you know, recognizing that what you really want to do is engage and not shut down. I think if you can find ways to find somebody to work with and articulate that that's what you're working on, to help you reach some more of the vulnerability, and practicing in baby steps is really helpful. So if you recognize you're stonewalling, you could even say to someone, you know, I realize what I'm doing now is shutting down or refusing to talk to you. And I want to get better at doing this. I want to try to talk to you about this. So, you know, the repeated behaviors hopefully train our brains to erase the old patterns and replace them with new ones. And is there something positive to be taken after an abusive no contact rule? I am a big fan of the no contact rule. I think in the vast majority of situations, you know, no contact rule means you, with somebody who's abusive, usually you stop talking to them altogether. I think that's the best and most effective way to break a trauma bond or an abusive relationship, because you can get so easily sucked back in if you do have contact with somebody who's been very unhealthy. So definitely no contact. Is there something positive to be taken after an abusive relationship? You know, I think that's a subjective question. I'm an optimist, so I like to say that sometimes, you know, we become stronger, we learn more about ourselves, we can use that to help others in their journeys. You know, there's definitely things that we can find that can be positive. It just depends where you are in your journey. Restraining orders can be very helpful. They don't, I wish they worked more than they don't, but yes, they can be helpful. Yeah.
Lena, somebody's asked, what was the book you talked about in the very beginning?
Which one? Which book? Oh, Attached. Here, let me start putting some books in here before everybody leaves. So I have Attached by Amir Levine. And where's my other book? I already put the Imago ones, which are keeping the love you find, getting the love you want. Oh, here's another one for the narcissistic parents. Adult children of emotionally immature parents. These are all on Amazon. So if you had experiences with parents, Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents is a really well-known book. For trauma, The Body Keeps the Score is one of the most effective books in the field. And Trauma and Recovery by Judith Herman is a good one as well for understanding trauma. So all those should be in the chat. And Rick recommends for everybody the Heart Brain Coherence Free Guided Audios to Calm and Relax. Thank you very much for that. Yeah, anybody who has suggestions for apps and things like that, I can never learn too much. So I'm always happy to hear anyone's suggestions. Thank you, Marilyn. Okay, so I guess if there are no, oh, what about more? Okay, maybe we'll take one more question. Thank you, Constantine. The cluster Bs are really tough, I know. Thank you, Muriel. There is a question, sorry, here, Christine. Yeah, I know, it's, if we could learn about this in our 20s, right? It took me 25 years. Love bombing is a bad sign. And yes, thank you. Our society's fairy tales and romance movies glamorize this. There was actually a study done about that, where they say romantic rom-coms encourage people to normalize stalker behaviors, which I thought was really interesting. There's actually a study on this. Yeah, the most intense love bombers are the quickest to leave, and you learned in late 30s how to set boundaries. Yeah. Yeah, the real deal, right? The real deal are the ones that sometimes we think that they're boring and we don't have the highs and lows of the roller coaster, but the real deal are the ones who don't do the love bomb and are just more normal and natural in the beginning and have a nice normal progression. It may not seem exciting at first to those of us who have the addiction to the excitement, but yeah, we definitely want people who are just the opposite of love bombers most of the time. Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much. It's really nice to hear from all of you. Thank you.
I just want to extend a huge thank you to you, Lena, for facilitating this session, and also to everybody for participating and for joining us.
Yes, thank you so much. It was such a pleasure, and I'm happy everybody joined. You're all so kind. Thank you. And I wish everybody the best in your journeys.